Welcome. Hi, I'm Brian Anderson here. This is being brought to you and sponsored by Eroded Impact. And today I wanted to take a little journey just on kind of a critical thinking expo, where really I visualize this as a three-part scenario where one, I'm going to set some baseline foundational concepts that I really wish we could just agree upon and say, yes, that is a stand-in for objective truth. Two, kind of frame what critical thinking looks like. What does a Socratic approach look like, and what does first principles look like, and kind of how does that all weave together? And then the third part here is literally just create some real world misalignments and things that I think people really struggle with as a team. I don't think we're alone here in this pain and frustration. And I think we're at a pivotal spot. We now, with the internet and the ability to communicate at the speed of light, where we really need to accept this responsibility. First, I want to talk about some foundational truths. We need to agree upon targets. If we can't agree what we're trying to accomplish, I think I'm going to get narrow here for a moment. Think about a sports team. You're like, our goal is to win. And because we accept that, you can now call different plays and you have a benchmark of how to measure actions. But within that little capsule, you're unified in what you're trying to accomplish, where you're trying to head, okay? So truth number one is we need a clear target and destination. So if you want better outcomes, then define better outcomes in the sense of literally, with the clarity of which we define it, determines how we can get there. Do we want wealth? Do we want less suffering? What are those? Get agreement. Truth number two is that objective truth matters. So subjective would be opinions. Objective is the closer, and sometimes a lot of people would agree. I have a science background, so for me it's like it's just true today. It could be proven wrong tomorrow. But we want to approach like, hey, yeah, the sky's blue. Yeah, I think the sky's blue too. Okay? That's a bad example because then it's like, what do we define blue as, right? But we need to acknowledge that they exist, acknowledge that we want to discover them and figure them out and agree on what's happening, what are facts, okay? And the second order reason of why this is so important is because you need that information to create the actions and triggers downstream. What's next? So we must orient towards objective truth, even if it's uncomfortable, because although emotion may spark action, it's logic that drives and creates those solutions. Truth number three, I want people to take a moment and understand the human creature. We have evolved. So we are an evolutionary being, 300,000, going back even before that as a whole evolutionary path, but as modern humans, and the way evolution works is it pushes a bunch of options out, and then it selects through pressure which things worked. So it tries a bunch of things. Some of those things are bad, okay? And hopefully they get moved out. If they're good, they get selected for, and you see more of it. But that's important because the human we are today, we got here through very specific selection paths. They're not absolutely true, okay? It's just better or worse repeated over a long period of time. But it's important to understand that it's also not accidental. There's real reasons that it was selected for from the environment, that it was considered an advantage, or sometimes neutrals just tag along. Things that were not to an advantage, those things went extinct. And that's true. Not absolutely true, but like I said, we need to accept that we have evolved for reasons. It would be very helpful and very beneficial to be able to acknowledge those reasons and give them validity. Because it's true, the path that we got here to the best as we can describe it. But truth number four is that we have an emotional component, an EQ, and a logical component. Okay, I'm just going to call it IQ. The right tool for the right job, they both have a purpose evolutionarily. From an EQ standpoint, emotion is really good to spur and trigger action. Empathy literally is the targeting system. What should we care about? Should I care about my friends, family, my child? Okay, it's the targeting system. But once we get that target, we need the logic system to decide how to act, how to get there, how to move, what the solution should look like, and put them kind of in order. Hey, let's try this. I think that's the best chance. And then here's our second one if that one doesn't fail. Because sometimes the stuff we do isn't going to work. So we kind of need that flow of the logic says, here's our execution system. Here's how we fix it. All right, let me move to stage 2. I want to take a moment and kind of walk through what critical thinking really is. The Socratic method is asking good questions and asking better questions and always asking so you learn. The drive there is to build a better truth, a better understanding of truth. First principle thinking is engineering from the end result backwards. So you go to the simplest component of the end result and you work backwards. Elon Musk is the most common throwdown right now. He believes in first principle thinking, but it matters. Like, he has reinvented space travel because he said, okay, what are the absolute smallest definition of the problems we're trying to overcome? And you build the solution backwards from there. Let me take a moment and talk about another component of that critical thinking, what they call choice architecture. Choice architecture is establishing through your environment basically a selective pressure. So you're still preserving freedom of choice, as in somebody can, actually the simplest example, I'll just jump ahead a little bit, is you can opt in or opt out. There's an amazing book called Nudge that talks about a retirement system over in Europe where they put all this energy into creating a great retirement. You think 401k, their version of it, had all these selective things, and the returns on it were like 17, 18, 19%. But the opt-in rate was 13. So that means most of the people chose not to select the plan, even though it was having really good results. So they talked and they figured it out. And through choice architecture, they said, what if we make the default? You can still opt in and opt out, but the default is that we're going to opt in because we think it's a good outcome. We spent time and energy to create this good solution. So the default was to opt people in. And they had like an 80% participation rate. And they got the desired outcome and result, which was, people have a retirement program and system that's really, really working. I also want to take a moment and talk about the role of basically propaganda, truth versus propaganda. This is really, really important because before the age of the internet, it was hard to get information. I guess technically the telephone helped. So you could say before the telephone, it was hard to get information. It was local newspapers, whatever. For the newspaper, what was it? Word of mouth. Like, how long would it take for some, news to travel? Well, that's not where we live. We live right now where truth or a lie can get around the world in a second. If you parallel that with understanding how motivation works from a psychological standpoint, what you see is the second propaganda there's a little distinction between propaganda and just straight lying. If it's cheaper than true innovation, what you see selected for is actually propaganda, because that's going to generate the result you want the fastest. And by the time the truth comes out, okay, we're seeing this right now with COVID-19. Yeah, it's this, do that. Yes, it is. Now we're finding out, the lab leak, was correct. And, it does seem like there's some problems. Okay, the truth right now is evolving. So if you need an anchor point, but you need to understand the motivation. If it becomes easier and more efficient for propaganda to generate whatever your desired outcome, in this case for businesses, it's money. For politics, it would be power. How do I get reelected? Well, I get the second you select for that instead of truth, you've got big problems. You've got sensationalism, you've got triggering emotions, and that's what you're seeing right now. So if you want to know why, it's because propaganda and spinning a narrative has become easier than the truth. To be a little bit more specific, more profitable. It's being motivated for and rewarded. So as individuals, we have to say, okay, how do I critically think? How do I bring that? How do I see this coming? How do I see the biases? How do I eliminate them? And how do I bring that all together? Before I go on to stage 3, there's one little add-on. It didn't fit into any category, but I want to take a moment and explore this too. We each have our value system and our perspective is directly derived and built from our lived experience. If you acknowledge that none of us have the same lived experience, you will understand from the beginning of a conversation that to find 100% alignment, is probably not gonna happen. But that's good, because it's actually in that tension point in the middle where you actually get the best ideas. Okay, all of the best ideas are going to be found somewhere in the middle, not at the extremes, because you get the value of both things. You get the emotional targeting, okay, but you get the logical results and execution and pragmatic. Hey, here's what we do. And a parallel to that is idealism versus realism, right? So an idealist is, here's how the world should be. There should be no starvation. There should be no famine. Okay, if we would agree that those are good targets, good things to try and accomplish, it would be very useful to know actual actions that are going to drive us towards that outcome. Okay, and I'm mostly, if you haven't figured, I'm talking like societal. Okay, all right, so one last thing that I want to sprinkle in. So there was just understand that no one's going to have your direct one-to-one alignment on a topic because they've had different experiences. One other thing to sprinkle in here is what I call alignment. And that's what we need is once you just find that goal, you align. So when I talk about that sports team, hey, we know what we're trying to do. We're trying to win. And then we can clearly define, maybe not with 100% accuracy, but with 98% accuracy, what options are going to, get us closer to winning. Okay? Because we've defined it. And then we've aligned as a team to move in that direction. All right. So let me talk through some of the funny things. This is the third part of the talk here. Is like some observations that I see. I'm mostly talking here in the US because that's my lived experience. But we get way off target. Let me start with GDP, gross domestic product. This is the most ridiculous benchmark to measure on the planet. So if inflation just doubled, like 100% inflation, your GDP would double. Like, it's the stupidest thing ever. It tells you nothing. Like you're tracking revenue. You're not tracking like profit effectively or success or happiness. So can we just be adults and can we acknowledge that we need to adopt another metric? There may be very good reasons why, as a nation, we started tracking that. But I think it's time to evolve way past that because it's the silliest. It's so easy to manipulate. And if you incentivize for manipulation of that number, that's what you're going to get. A couple other good ones that I struggle with. Take the money out of news, because if there's money in it, it literally drives the biases. It drives the divide. You're seeing it. Everyone would agree. You got your liberal left leaning, okay, and then you've got your conservative right leaning. But the reason they're doing it is because that's what's driving money. Yeah, but how do you solve this? If you can acknowledge that that's a problem and you don't want that, how do you get the money out of truth? If that's what you believe, if you believe news should be about truth and knowledge, not entertainment. We could debate that. Yeah, there's one outcome that's clearly a better path, okay, which is remove the money. Same thing with our politicians, okay? If you're motivating and rewarding politicians to be effectively corrupt, surprise, what you get is corrupt politicians, okay? Now, maybe they're not completely corrupt on all things, but like wealthy, like in corporate pocket, because they took up, it's effectively, I like to see like campaign financing as a starting point. Tell me a version that campaign financing doesn't drive towards more corruption. You see, more money, it's a bribe, equals more corruption. Oh, is that what you've seen? Yes, it is. Now, if our leaders aren't brave enough to understand that, then we need to elect different leaders. And if they are brave enough, well, then do it. Because understand that from a first principles standpoint, all that's going to do is broaden the gap because you're motivating corruption. Same thing with like the insider trading component. Of course, it's just logical that anyone that's that public servant that is on these committees or has privy to insider trading knowledge should absolutely not be rewarded for it, because it will reward their behaviors, therefore change their behaviors, and some of those outcomes will be corrupt. Yeah, you need to remove the motivation or minimize the motivation by alignment. That's a little bit of my rant for you guys. I want you, obviously let's have a discussion in the comments. If you see this, please chime in, add on, tell me your thoughts. You can call out, some of your fundamentals or some of your belief systems, and make sure to chime in and put in there the silly things that, healthcare is another great one. Like, just like, I don't know, money to some degree. So, so the whole monetary system has gone to digital. Now the federal government acknowledges and accepts the role of the dollar, right? It makes the dollar, and technically your tax money, pay for it, but it accepts that responsibility. But 90% of the world is, maybe more, is digital, but somehow that's just an extra 4% that the government isn't involved in. And it's like, that seems at least a little behind. And the question would be, should the government actually, so if you don't know this, the government has to be in charge of the money system or else it loses too much power. So it needs to be. So it's like, hey, well, can you just accept the responsibility, because 90% is through, digital capacity right now, and it's getting leaner. So my challenge to you guys is to work and develop critical thinking skills, understand the component of emotional, and we think about the most emotional person you know. Okay, I got news for you. That emotion is necessary. Okay, empathy is really good for targeting, for deciding how to treat people when used accurately and in a good frame. But then you also need the yin and yang. You need the logic component, which is, here's how we execute, here's what we do with that emotion. Okay, and both create the outcome that's desired. So if you just have that screaming lunatic who's just emotional all the time, okay, they're not going to have good outcomes, because you're leaning into this. And if you can see that in yourself, ask yourself, which side do you fall on, or are you in the middle? You can understand what your strength is and what your weakness is. All right, so come along on that journey with me. Like, subscribe, do all that stuff, and contribute, man, because I really think we're in a time now where our voices matter. We can get heard. We can put our voices out, and our ideas matter, because we have to fight towards that truth and away from that sensationalized propaganda and BS. All right. Thank you all for your time. I really appreciate it. And hopefully you got something meaningful out of this, something that I think about too often. And I wanted to share it with all of you. Be great.